Improvement, like conventional wisdom, is a concept that probably says more about your sensibilities than the media you apply it to. Is Dark Souls better than Demon Souls because it has an interconnected world design? Getting the Souls mentions out of the way early here. Or is it just different? Last time around, I said that the original Kingsfield contained the entire ludological core which 15 years later would spring on the world as Demon Souls and the expanded Miyazaki-led FromSoft library. Last time around, I also said that although Kingsfield 1 was great, its sequels were even better. And I still believe that to be true. The subsequent entries into this franchise all brought something new to the table and tried to implement the Kingsfield formula in new and interesting ways. The first game was an often clumsy jab at the dungeon crawling experience, with certain design decisions pulling it in directions which it probably wasn't served going. Kingsfield 2 irons out some of those issues, but again, like Dark Souls did to Demon Souls, I feel that some of the magic was lost in the transition. It's a much more confident outing, and it was much better received than the original, but in spite of the numerous improvements it made on all fronts, and it pretty much does, it still has a few of the first game's pitfalls, along with some new ones, created by its own larger scope, which I feel hold it back from really nailing this experience. Hi, I'm AesirAesthetics, and in this video, we'll be going over Kingsfield 2 in depth. In case you want to prepare yourself before watching and play the game first, look for Kingsfield 2, or if you live outside of Japan, like most of us statistically do, Kingsfield 1 in your non-Japanese releases. Also, this video picks up directly where my Kingsfield 1 video left off, so I've gotta suggest that you start with that one, then make your way back here. All of these formalities out of the way, grab yourself a cup of coffee and strap in as we take a look back at Kingsfield 2. If you want to have a good time, I recommend offhandedly stating in a video that Kingsfield 1 never released outside of Japan, and not explaining the intricacies of why not before moving on. That sort of editorial mistake on your part will have you answering the same comment 100 times. There is a Kingsfield 1 that released outside of Japan, but it's not the original Kingsfield. It's this game. They just changed the name. Kingsfield was one of the very first games to ever launch on the PlayStation 1, doing so merely 13 days after the console itself launched and a total 10 months before the console released outside of Japan. In that short interim, From Software completed their work on this game, and it was decided to, instead of going back and translating the original to squeeze some added value from this franchise, to instead just rename it and start the outside world's relationship with Kingsfield here. This game's Japanese launch was a mere 7 months after the original, and its European release was roughly a year after the original and 2 months after the launch of the PlayStation 1. It was a holiday release, fun fact. And the North American release was in the following February. Unlike its predecessor, it garnered fairly universal critical acclaim, with a few stragglers still kicking around the complaints from last time. The Japanese response was that Kingsfield 2 improved from what the first one did, but like the Western reviews, there's still a lot of complaining about the game being its own thing. Main character moves slowly, the game is hard, the levels all look the same, the combat is repetitive, and look, this is all true, but, not that I need to tell you, dear viewer, there are things you cannot do without the proper presentation. You want Breath of the Wild gameplay and Majora's Mask atmosphere? Too bad, Breath of the Wild gameplay is gonna get you Breath of the Wild atmosphere. This sentiment is understood today, but back in the 90s it wasn't. The idea that gameplay was more than a means to an end was kinda novel back then. If you want to see some unprofessional critics, check out this game's reviews. It's all 8s and 9s, but however flowery the language, the critics couldn't stop themselves from ending their reviews by saying that Kingsfield is no Doom. As if Kingsfield needs to be Doom. This game excels at being itself, and what it does well, it does mainly because of the way the game is presented, not in spite of it. But before talking about the hows of the game's presentation, let's briefly explore what. After the end of the first game, John Alfred Forrester, or Gene Alfred Forrester, depending on your translation, we'll go with Gene for future continuity, was crowned king almost immediately upon exiting the graveyard, having defeated Reinhardt III, whom I erroneously referred to as the Dark Wizard in my last video. Sorry. This game takes place a few years later, and like the first game did, it opens on a text scroll which reads,
or a demon who controlled the island, and no one tried to go there. A high elf in the forest told of a blue light that came down from the sky and struck the island. The blue light penetrated deep into the island's underworld. For hundreds of years, the island had been carved by people who were challenged and destroyed by the island's energy. Legends say, never approach the island, for a sleeping beast in the darkness waits for a great awakening.
And like the first game's story, so far this is little more than pretense to contextualize the happenings around us. But it also has a couple of things going for it, which the first game did not so early on. For one, since this game is a sequel, it builds on the lore and goodwill of the first game, which endows it with expectations of a realized story, which the first game didn't really do until halfway through. That is, if you're Japanese, Euro and America folks gotta grind for that. Another thing this game has going for it, which the first one didn't, is the proper setting of stakes early on. The first game's introduction alluded to mysterious happenings, but waited until later on to imbue itself with the otherworldly and divine. This worked great in that game's favor since it had the fantasy gradually open up to the player, with early level lore being made manifest deeper in the graveyard, but that's not really a trick you can play twice. The Kingsfield license is already characterized by the first game as one which deals with fantastical elements, and acknowledging that early on is probably the right decision. A few years after the first game, Gene had become a national figure along with the holy moonlight sword handed to him by the first game's deity. With this sword, Gene vanquished evil, but, setting the stage for the events of this game, the sword was eventually stolen. Rumors circulated that the sword had become a cause of massive inquiry by the ruler of the island of Melanad. Gene's attempts to reacquire the sword went nowhere, so he turned to a friend of his, someone whom he considered to be the equivalent of a brother, Alexander, to retrieve the sword for him. Alexander was aware of the island's legend, the one about the great power from the text scroll, and wanted to help Gene and discover the source of Melanad's great power, so he decided to take a journey. But his ship was met with a flock of demons who destroyed it and sunk his entire crew, leaving Alexander to drift to the beach of Melanad, stripped by the elements of all his equipment bar a dagger he had in his boot. With no path of retreat open to him, Alexander then ventured forwards into the island. I'll circle around this idea a few times, so keep it in mind. The leap from Kingsfield 1 to Kingsfield 2 is very similar to the leap from Demon Souls to Dark Souls. And in terms of the early game story, Alexander, like the Chosen Undead would be, is isolated in a hostile world, whereas Gene, like the Slayer of Demons would, had some early game allies. Kingsfield 2, whether by choice or technological limitations, maintains the first game's minimalistic presentation of narrative, relying more on the ambience and the core gameplay loop to keep the player engaged. The changes this game made from its predecessor's world design sensibilities would also be mirrored by Demon Souls and Dark Souls. Kingsfield 1 took place in a graveyard composed of 5 self-contained levels, which you made your way through in a linear fashion. Demon Souls similarly had 5 self-contained linear levels, but you could traverse them in any order you wanted. Kingsfield 2, like Dark Souls, jettisons this linear nonsense in favor of an open and interconnected world. The first King's Fields levels were 99% flat because verticality was really not a consideration when it came to designing the levels. Some steps here and there aside, it would have been possible to render the entire game's world in 2D, as is evidenced by the game's maps. But Dark Souls 1, this world is not. We're still dealing with blocky levels textured with no charisma whatsoever. Thankfully, the game maintains the design decision from the first game to keep the narrative in lock with the world. Level design is the most pronounced narrative bottleneck games have. Advancing through one advances the other, and here, the deeper you get and more you explore, the more you uncover the plot. Straightforward enough. Interestingly though, the environments here are mostly not self-contained. A lesson Dark Souls would not learn with the exception of its best area, New Londo. There you could not fight the four kings without the Covenant of Artorias, which was found elsewhere in the world. Mostly, however, like the crystal that you need to break to kill Seath or the ring you need to walk on lava, the levels locked progression with items they themselves contained. Special shout out to the Tomb of the Giants and its darkness. It gives you a lantern, but no one uses that. This is, I think, the best improvement Kingsfield 2 makes on its predecessor. It locks progress behind keys and items found elsewhere. This breaks down the linearity so much, and because it forces you to constantly track over the same areas again, you very quickly get attuned to the world. These soulless, jittery gray walls that all look the same actually start to not feel the same. Another wonderful inclusion in this game is that it has traps you can't escape from. You fall in a hole, and unless you've set up your warp, you just gotta reload your last save point. This makes exploration very uncertain, and it feeds well into the key system here. Most locked doors are opened by these little shuriken-looking keys, which only have one use each. You can buy them for a hefty price, but in the early game, your strategy will be caution. When I first arrived in the prison and realized I didn't have any more keys to progress, I tried to turn back, but found that the back way also required a key. I was genuinely afraid that I'd fallen into another trap, but a sneaky hidden door in one of the cells brought me to a magical fountain, and at that moment I knew I was dealing with something else. Keys being resources makes it more dangerous to explore on low resources here than in the first game. You never know if you're gonna screw yourself, and the non-linearity with which you can open up the world is really a sight to behold. However, even though this map is more realized than what we saw in the first game, it's not as realistic. The first game knew its limitations, so it didn't try to create anything as complex as a town. Here, we're running through tunnels to get to a boxy room with a sky texture and a boxy house. This setup is not as palatable as the towns would be in the next outing, but in spite of its gamey appearance, I've gotta commend it for aiming higher than its predecessor did. Perfect landing, no, but not a disaster. As for the world we're exploring, it front-loads its inconveniently similar-looking areas, so you need to get over that hurdle, which you do after finding a few maps. But those are 2D maps, which do not have any markers, so you may want to have a pen and paper handy to help you along. I prefer the non-self-contained levels here to the first games, but I won't pretend that the drawbacks are non-existent. The benefit of the 5 levels of the first game was that since each one had everything you needed to complete it, even if you lost your heading, provided you were in the lowest level open to you, you were never more than 1 or 2 minutes away from making some progress. Here, that's not the case. Kingsfield's minimalistic presentation of narrative makes Miyazaki's games look like Kojima games in comparison, so unavoidably, you're gonna waste time not knowing where to go, and because of the interconnected world, even more than you did in the first game. Another difference between the two games is that here, your first moments playing the game are spent outside. There are a few paths open right from the get-go, but you really are supposed to go straight. This is made clear by an overpowered boss to the left, and that the right and right backwards path are both somewhat obfuscated. This is in stark contrast to the first game, where you really just had one heading at any given time. This game does not feature a truly branching narrative, but There is way more wiggle room to the order in which to solve problems than in the first game. While I really like this change, I feel the game's visuals are a bit too lagging behind for the landing to stick. It's still enemies made from abstract and obtuse shapes in jittery areas. It's a bit nicer than in the first game, but it's a bit too samey looking for a lot of the game, and maybe it would have served the presentation better to streamline the map a bit. Not that you won't overcome this issue, you will in time, but there are a few too many times in the early game where I was fighting the game's visuals rather than exploring. Once you really unlock the map, the ways to maneuver through it, and become intimately familiar with it, however, there's a richness of environmental diversity awaiting you halfway through, and although the texture work here is kinda crap, it still gets the job done of differentiating terrain and material. Coinciding with the mid-game world enriching is an opening up of the exploration tools at our disposal. Everything I said about the first game's movement is back with some notable tweaks and additions. For one, the camera movements feel a bit faster. There's now a run option which drops your available mana and power bar to 0, a fine trade-off since it only takes a few seconds to completely regenerate those, but you know, those few seconds are still enough to get completely screwed if you run into a combat situation. There's also a lot of stairs here, which means environments become truly three-dimensional. Now this game came before Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time, so there wasn't yet a rulebook on how to do 3D levels, but it's still functional. The level design itself does little to guide player behavior, but as a canvas for doing things in, it's totally fine considering it's a 25-year-old game and your way of looking up and down in it is to press the R2 and L2 buttons. Where the control scheme really starts to take its toll, however, is with the combat system. See, we have a 3D world now, so ranged enemies can now attack you from different elevation, and since moving the camera is still slow, you're gonna find yourself doing a 3-second little dance while you get your guy to turn around, because otherwise the arrows would just hit you. You have a bow, which is a welcome inclusion, even though the aforementioned slow camera movement makes it functionally more like a spear than anything else. You're rarely moving the camera to a specific enemy in the elevated distance with this weapon. You're probably just going to attack things in your immediate eyeline that are far away. Something I will note as a positive change in the combat, however, is that it feels like the slow camera movement was factored a bit more into the enemy AI. Also, the areas which house the enemies are much better themed than they were in the first game. You have a pirate skeleton area, ghost caves, termite caves, etc., and they all house a consistent and predictable enemy type. Last time this was more scattershot, and because of this tighter placement of enemies, there's now an actual strategy to weapons, since you're not just shifting through them at every encounter, but rather every time you enter a new area. There are also bosses this time around. The first game had 2, technically, but functionally only 1 you'd ever pick out from the rest of the enemies. Here, the bosses are plentiful, and even the ones who are reskinned enemies have the decency to be large enough for you to know that these are indeed bosses. And their placement is as deliberate as what's usually on display here. They don't so much serve as cap-offs to areas as they do waypoint markers and spectacle. An example of the former can be seen in the starting point, which has a large kraken enemy just a few steps to the left, signaling that you're going to have to return to that area at some point. The final area has a boss gauntlet where you defeat 5 enemies and then reach the final boss, and the results of these shakeups, I think, make King's Field 2 really excel in comparison to its predecessor. I talked about that game's save point system in the first video, and everything there is true here too, with some added decision making. You don't warp to get to new levels here, the entire map is interconnected, but warping is still possible, provided you make it. Each save point here has a guidepost which you can insert a key into, and if you have the key's corresponding gate, you can warp right back to that guide point at any time. The thing is though, there's a limited amount of these keys, so you need to be strategic in where and whether or not to place them. They give you a get out of jail free card if you ever fall into a hidden pit, but putting one down means you're locked into that as your warp point until you pick the key up again and move it. The ramification this has on the combat experience is interesting. In the first game, dead enemies respawned after you went far enough away from them, which meant that if you were to retreat to purchase more healing items, you'd need to avoid them or fight them again. Here, dead enemies also respawn, but you can avoid fighting them again by warping. But then, you might find that the warp will take you much further away from your current objective than the next save point or merchant is. It's a very well thought out tool to liberate the experience, especially in the early game, and when you progress and have more than one of these keys, the reduced downsides of warping reflect your character's growth in the world, and this is implemented without breaking the moment-to-moment gameplay that was so good in the first game. Maybe this is what the Lord Vessel warping in Dark Souls 1 should have been like. Anyways, some unfortunate carryovers from the last game include the economy going to crap after a few hours. It's actually fairly broken right off the bat here. And the wall-hugging strategy is still mostly viable. It's much more boring since the area is much larger, but it's still viable. The healing is a bit better since there's more ways to get it done. The levels are designed to periodically lead you to a fountain which heals you, and you can get bottles, and the vendors who sell you healing grass are actually fairly nicely spaced out. The Fog of War returns and seems to have been actually factored into level design. It hides secret areas better than it did in the first game and obfuscates elevated ranged enemies in larger rooms, which imbues the combat with some tactical considerations. And an all-around upgrade is the game's heightened focus on characters from the last time around. The first game was about finding warp sigils which let you descend deeper. This game is more reliant on specific keys and the quests which the NPCs give you. The world doesn't tell its story by itself, so you're going to be talking to these characters a lot to have them paint the otherwise grey-looking experience. Design-wise, the characters here are very similar to in the first game, but functionally, the open world gives them a new dimension since you'll be returning to them for lore and resources. In the first game, each NPC was mostly a one-and-done affair. A nice decision from last time around returns in that the quests are incredibly transient. No log collects them, they aren't reduced to a mere checklist. Like in the first game, regardless of how much of a lore whore you are, you'll need to interact with these characters to advance, and doing so will have you go through depraved and depressed stories, and like in the first game, there's rarely a missed opportunity to hammer home the game's dark atmosphere. Also returning is the final spurt, feeling like the end of a System Shock or Silent Hill, where all of a sudden you move from a nightmarish setting straight into a hellscape with enemies who are so much more powerful than anything before them that it doesn't even feel like you're meant to fight them. This is doubly true here. The System Shock part especially, where the last boss is fought in what feels like the cyberspace fight from the first System Shock, or maybe even the showdown fight from System Shock 2. All of a sudden, there are these crazy Tron lines everywhere and a giant dragon. But that other part is also relevant. The crazy overpowered enemies from the end of Kingsfield 1 created a hectic final gauntlet for you to run through until you acquired the Moonlight Sword, and then that gauntlet became incredibly easy, as a means of communicating just how important that sword was. Here, however, the final enemies are meant to be defeated, but they're still as hard as a sack of bricks. Kingsfield 2 is much more deliberate in its use of difficulty as a means to set the stakes and ambience than the first one was, and it's also a much darker game than its predecessor in general. The hidden quest threaded through the first game was to acquire the aforementioned Holy Moonlight Sword. Here, that's the main narrative goal, with the hidden quest being the acquisition of the Dark Slayer. And no, not a sword which slays darkness, a dark sword which slays. The Moonlight Sword deals light elemental damage, the Dark Slayer deals all elemental damage except for light. This sword was created by Seath, whereas the Moonlight Sword was created by this game's final boss, Gyra, whose projection we met in the first game, and which kinda looks like Calamite from Dark Souls, what with the one eye and all. This game retcons that gift as a ploy by Gyra to have a strong warrior come to Melanat to awake the island's resonant darkness, which is Gyra itself. You know what, this just won't do. In the beginning, God existed, but couldn't communicate all too well with humanity, so he decided to send two angels, or aspects of itself, I'm honestly not quite sure yet, down to do the job instead. These two angels being the white dragon Seath and the black dragon Gyra. These two became prideful and started waging war with each other for supremacy. At some point, Gyra broke a black crystal which controlled the power of nature, and in doing so paid a hefty penalty. The Moonlight Sword was, as I mentioned earlier, a means to choose a powerful warrior to come to Melanet to revive Gyra. The Dark Slayer is assembled from pieces of the dark crystal Gyra broke, which Seath originally gave to the High Elves, and it's a perfect weapon for putting an end to the Melanet nightmare. But not before reacquiring the Moonlight Sword and watching the end text scroll explain that the two magic swords will forever be sealed away, and that the world shall live in harmony ever after. After all, it's not like Seath will try to gain power now that he is unopposed, right? More on that in a look back at Kingsfield 3. The story of Kingsfield 2 does what good sequels tend to do and expands on the mythos. The slave operation and the discovery that the light sword was created by the black dragon and vice versa asks the player to question the moral foundation of what was presented in the first game as a fairly straightforward fantasy game, and although I still like the earnestness of that first game, I gotta say, Kingsfield 2 did it better. In the first game, the mysticism was gradually unfurled to the player, and each layer put them deeper into the throes of the world's history, with kings from ancient times coming to speak their minds and tangle up the complexity of the lore. Here, the same basically happens, except instead of this, the late game unfurling plot looks like this. And it hits harder than it maybe should, probably because it juxtaposes so hard from the more conventional fantasy of its immediate predecessor. Like the first game, Kingsfield 2 isn't perfect, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't love it. It's such an Aesir game. I'm all about what this game is doing. Antiquated but unique, often janky game design principles, weird fantasy teetering on survival horror, and the veneer of a wholesome fairy tale ending. I said in my video on the first game that it screamed great bedrock, and now you might understand what I meant by that. Every shortcut that game took to work is fleshed out here, and it's wonderful. Kingsfield 2 in many ways vindicates the first game, as it shows you just how smart that game was. All of a sudden, the sometimes crazy design decisions from there make perfect sense now that the team has had more experience to put those decisions to good use. Kingsfield 2, with a few reservations, is a straight-on upgrade. Almost everything it does better than its predecessor. Father Time makes fools of us all, and the first Kingsfield is mired in a lot of jank. Kingsfield 1 was a blast largely, though not exclusively, because it was the bedrock of modern From Software. Kingsfield 2 sticks the landing, but like the first game, it's doing some not so great flips in the air. If you're looking for a Kingsfield which nailed it from beginning to end, unfortunately this isn't it. You're looking for Kingsfield 3. That being said, if you can stomach a bit of jank, and if you have a free weekend and a pencil and some paper lying around, you might surprise yourself with how much you'd enjoy taking a look back at Kingsfield 2. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe for more like it, as well as browse around this channel to see if there is anything else that piques your interest. If you liked this video, you might like my other Kingsfield video, the Demon Souls videos, and if you're visiting from the future, you might also enjoy the subsequent Kingsfield videos I made. I'm still operating this channel on the bi-monthly release schedule, where every month I switch from making YouTube videos and making my video game. Last month, I overhauled the entire movement system to enable a snappier octagonal movement complete with diagonal hitboxes. I also finalized the foundations of enemy AI, the overworld, the day and night system, and made the inventory system. A very productive month, I must say. For more frequent updates on the channel's happenings, I'd recommend subscribing as well as listening to the Essays&Espresso podcast. The footage I used in this video was applied by Classic L337, Burntpinz Gaming, and WorldofLongplays as played by Deskawa, who are all cool and linked below. Be sure to check them out. Also linked below is my Patreon, where I give early access to videos to members. Currently, the Kingsfield 3 analysis and the long-awaited Deus Ex analysis are up there, and if you want to get an early look, chuck in as little as $1. I hope this video was worth the time you spent watching it. For the rest of July, I'll be getting back to work on Project BB, working title for my game, and then I'll get back to working on videos for you guys in August. I'll continue with my exploration into the pre-Miyazaki FromSoft library with a video on Kingsfield 4, and something else, something non-FromSoft, which I haven't decided on. Maybe Baldur's Gate, or a Ratchet & Clank, or a Zelda, or something. If you have some ideas for games you'd like to see covered next August, be sure to leave your suggestion in the comments. I've been AesirAesthetics, and until next time, take care.